Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to continue the series on the Petrov Defense with my favorite variation, the Nimzowitsch Attack, and what I believe is the most aggressive variation white could play against the Petrov. Now, in the introductory video, we've been looking over the options for black and for white, and I gave you a brief intro to the ideas for both sides, so if you haven't seen the introductory video, please do. And today we are going to focus on the Nimzowitsch Attack. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight to f6, the Petrov defense, instead of defending with knight to c6, attacking the e4 pawn instead, or counter-attacking. And white continues with his most principled move, takes the pawn, black plays d6. As we said, knight takes e4 isn't a good idea, it gives white a better position. The knight should retreat. There are options of knight c4 and knight d3. As was mentioned in the comments, knight to d3 was played by Magnus Carlsen in the World Championship match, and I'm going to go over that variation in a separate video. But knight to f3 is the main move, and after knight takes e4, yesterday we went over d4, the classical attack or the classical variation, also the main line, which is considered to be the most principled way for white to fight the Petrov defense. We are also going to go over the move queen to e2. I'm going to cover that tomorrow. And today we are looking at the most aggressive move, and the move which comes with a concession immediately, knight to c3. And the concession is that you are basically giving black the option to take your knight and double your pawns, which means that you are going to have a worse structure. Now, with that comes the very aggressive idea of white castling queenside and crushing black, and this is why I like the variation. I have only played, one tournament game in this variation, and it ended up being pretty boring. Unfortunately, the variation went, I took with the pawn, and I ended up playing knight d4 with my pawn on c3, he took with his c6 knight, and we got a completely symmetrical pawn structure like this, and the game ended in a draw. But if your opponent wishes to play risky chess, then you are going to have a risky game. Of course, black can play it safely, black can play it aggressively, and white is basically giving up his intentions pretty early on with 5 knight to c3. We are going to look at two sidelines. Of course, taking is the main move, but I want to look at two moves first. By far the most popular is knight takes c3, and there have been about 500 games with the move knight to f6. Among others, Wang Hao played it, Wesley So played it, Vladimir Kramnik played it, so it's definitely a playable move. But I think that it's not the best move. Now, once d4 is played, white sort of wishes this knight weren't here, and that's the point of knight to f6, because it's now really hard to play the move c4, and even though the knight is controlling nice squares in the center and on the queen side, white would really like to have it on c3 after the pawn has moved to c4. So this variation sort of doesn't give white the option to expand any further because he doesn't have the e pawn and the c4 pawn is locked. So bishop to e7, bishop to d3, castles, white plays h3, preventing bishop to g4, rook to e8, and now castles to get away from any discoveries. And this position is equal, I would say, because white is up in development, and black has to sort out his queenside pieces, but it's really hard for white to do much to punish that. And that's why I think knight to f6 is an okay move, but still taking should be better. Knight bd7 developing, rook to e1, knight to f8 is the plan coming into g6, and the most aggressive try for white, which I don't really like, is d5 in this position, a move which gains space in the center and reduces the scope of the white pieces, stops knight to e6, but it does give away two key squares, c4, c5 and e5, so if the knight ever maneuvers back, then these two squares are going to be great, especially the e5 square. So this variation, well, if this is the way to fight for white, and white is slightly better, then fine, but I'm not too convinced that there's anything much going on here. The good thing for white is that the bishop on c8 doesn't have scope. Where do you develop the bishop? You can only go to d7. On the other hand, if white manages to play a maneuver such as b6, bishop b7, then the overextended d5 pawn is going to be in trouble. So yeah, black should probably play h6 here to stop the development of the c1 bishop, because I think most often white wants to trade off this bishop for the knight to make sure he can remaneuver his pieces and then play c4 to make sure this bishop is stupid for the rest of the game. So f6 is a playable move, and if you want to play it with the black pieces, then well, you are not accepting the gift that white gave you, doubling his pawns. And still, if you double the pawns, if you take on c3, the position isn't over, the position isn't much better for white, he just has better attacking chances, so I wouldn't recommend this. Another sideline I want to look at, I really don't think is good, is d5. And this sort of tries to go into the classical, into the main line with the knight being on c3, which is awkward. So if white continues with the move d4, then he has a bad classical with the knight on c3, which means that he cannot play the move c4, and you're once again giving black the option to double your pawns in a less favorable way. So after d5, the main move for white is queen to e2, and now after bishop to e7, which is black's best move, white can win a pawn. For some reason, knight takes c3 isn't popular here. I'm sorry, it's impossible here, but in the earlier variation, knight takes c3 wasn't possible. So for some reason, this variation seems to be playable for black, and people seem to play it, even though I don't see the compensation for the pawn. So obviously, bishop to e7 threatens to take on c3, but yeah, after bishop to e7, just simply knight e4, d4, queen e4, castles, threatening rook to e8, but black is too slow because of bishop c4. He still has to move the bishop, bishop f6 and castles. After rook to e8, queen to f4. I mean, if you can see the compensation for the pawn, please let me know, I just cannot see it. And white actually wins 75% of these games, which is really rare for the Petrov. So this move, in my opinion, should be avoided. After knight c3, d5, after queen e2, well, what do? I mean, bishop e7 is the most popular move. The engine says bishop e7 and +1 for white. I don't think you can do much else. Perhaps, nothing really. Perhaps you can try to defend like this, but I guess it's bad for some reason, I'm not sure. Yeah, just d3. Yeah. Okay, so this variation I wouldn't say is playable. So after knight c3, d5, and trying to enter the normal classical Petrov doesn't really work. So okay, let's finally go to the main move and the most principled move, and the move that you're going to see in 99% of your games, knight takes c3. You always have to take with the d-pawn, because your intention is to castle queenside, and the fact that you are bringing another pawn to the center with b takes c3 doesn't really help. dc3, black's main and best and probably only move is bishop to e7, preparing to castle, leaving the option of either bishop to e6, knight to c6 or castles, which are the three moves black generally wants to play. White now continues either with bishop f4 or bishop to e3, and you always move the bishop and the queen in these variations because you want to castle queenside as soon as possible. Bishop to f4, I would say, slightly inferior, and it's also a rarer move. Here, black continues either with knight c6 or castles, and if black castles, then knight d7 is the move to play, staring at e5 and c5. And after knight to c6, the plans are slightly different. So after knight c6, queen to d2, bishop to e6, castles. You might wonder, what about this pawn? We are going to look at several possibilities and several positions in which black does take. But queen to d7 is the main move, and now king to b1. And black is going to castle queenside, and black doesn't want to accept an opposite side castling position in which, well, white stands slightly better, because white has the semi-open d file and his major pieces are more active. So yeah, castles queenside and black should be fine. If after bishop e6 castles, black decides to take the pawn, then in theory white is winning, but there have been some games where strong players have taken the pawn and they've managed to win, so it's not that simple. The point is that after b3 trapping the bishop, black has the advance a5, a4, and this is a theme which you need to remember in case black ever captures, and in case you play the Petrov with the black pieces, then you need to remember that sometimes you can get ample compensation for the piece. So a5, king to b2, threatening to take the bishop, a4, king takes a2, a takes b3, king takes b3, castles. Now here the engine says white is winning, it's +2, but I'm not really sure about this variation. It seems fairly tricky because your king is almost completely naked on the queen side. The only defense it has are the c2 and the c3 pawns and the pieces. And the rook is already on the open a file, the queen can join the rook, the knight is able to check immediately from a6. The bishop seems scary after the move d5, so yeah, I really think that black has sufficient chances in this opening and that black should be okay with great play. Of course, if you are playing a supercomputer or a strong grandmaster, then well, you might win with white pieces, but I think this is scary. The engines think that bishop to e2 is the best move, trying to get the other rook into play, and still don't take the pawn if you are not sure that you can win this position with black. Try to find some tricks and perhaps you can do well. So let's go back. After knight c6, queen to d2, bishop to e6 castles. Bishop to e6 castles is one variation, and now queen to d7, king b1, castles queenside is what you should play. The other move after knight c6, queen to d2, the other move which I find great is the move bishop g4. This move simply pins the knight to the king, and still after black castles queenside, which is going to happen, black will often have a chance to double up the pawns on the f-file, which is going to be useful in an endgame. White continues with bishop to e2, therefore, trying to stop this idea. Queen to d7, castles, castles. Yeah, and I think that the move bishop to g4 is slightly better because there are none of these teams with bishop takes a2, and the fact that you can get your bishop to g6 or back to e6 if need be. So white should play h3 here, chasing the bishop away. And there are some ideas with bishop h5 and here. You're not really worried about this move because for now the bishop is defending, but even if it wasn't, allowing this capture would open up the black rook and black would be fine. So yeah, but the main move isn't bishop to h5, it's bishop to e6, staring at the a2 pawn, which I guess is more active, but I actually like the bishop on g6. I've been looking at positions with getting my bishop to g6. And now white doesn't have to defend the pawn really because the rook isn't on a8, so king b1 is unnecessary, b3 is unnecessary. You can just play rook h to e1, getting your other rook to the center. And I think that this position is very promising. There are a lot of things going on. Of course, in any endgame, black is going to be slightly better because he has a better pawn structure, but there's a long way to utilizing that advantage, and even though it's doubled pawns, it doesn't really mean that much because on the other side of the board the pawn structure is symmetrical. The kings are castled queenside, so the white king can safeguard these pawns, and if you remove all the pieces of the board, I don't think black can win this. So okay, this was the move bishop to f4, and the bishop on f4, yeah, after bishop f4 let's look at castles too. We just looked at knight to c6. The problem with bishop to f4 is that sometimes you're going to return it to e3. If black castles here, which is I think great for white because white would like to have opposite side castling to increase the attacking chances. Queen to d2, knight to d7. As I said, when you castle short, then your knight doesn't really belong on c6, your knight belongs in the center controlling e5 and c5. White castles, knight c5 immediately, and now bishop to e3. Bishop to e3 doesn't really threaten to take the knight, that's not the main move in the variation if black doesn't do anything, but I like the move bishop takes knight. And even though you give black the bishop pair, you can exchange the queens off and have a slightly better position, but yeah, the theory doesn't like the move and the engines don't like the move. So after rook to e8, bishop takes c5 is equal. You have gained the tempo because of rook to e8, so now after takes, the bishop will probably take. And white stands slightly better, a bit more space, a bit more development. You could say a target on c5, but it can be defended with b6, but realistically, not too many chances. So after rook to e8, you should just try to continue normally with your development. Moves such as bishop to c4 and then getting your other rook to e1. Ideas with h4 and trying to open up the king side also come to mind because this knight, well, it is controlling the e4 square and it can jump into e4 right now, but how useful is that really? So okay, after castles, remember that you simply go for your plan, queen d2, knight d7 castles, and if knight c5 comes, you can ignore that. You can also take it if you are hoping for a draw, but yeah, I would recommend that you play bishop to e3, and after rook to e8, play normal developing moves, or play h4, h5. But as I said, bishop f4 is not the main move. After knight c3, knight takes c3, d takes c3, bishop to e7, the main move is bishop to e3. And now, if the variation with knight c5 should happen, you at least have the option of taking the knight immediately, if you should wish so. And the bishop also seems more useful on e3 than on f4 in my opinion, because on f4 it's staring at this wall of pawns and it doesn't have too many targets. Okay. Now black has two options, once again, either castles short or knight to c6, once again with the same ideas in mind. If knight c6 is played, black wants to castle queenside. If black castles kingside, then you already know, and you want h4, h5 and pushing on. So for black I would recommend the move knight c6 here, and it is the main move. Let's just briefly look at castles. Castles, queen to d2 of course, and play is fairly simple for white. These three moves are going to be played always. So knight to d7, castles, knight to e5. And here, once again, you can take, but you don't have to. If black wishes to take on f3, then fine, you're opening up the g-file and you would actually be happy for that to happen. At the moment, black is threatening the move knight to c4, I'm sorry. Forking your queen and bishop, but you don't really care about that either, because if that's played, and let's say the knight is defended, let's say the bishop is on e6, which can happen. If that happens, you can simply take the knight off, because your bishop is still undeveloped. So black will have lost 1, 2, 3 moves to capture, and you have developed your undeveloped piece to take, so this is favorable when it comes to development. So in this position you are not really worried about any knight maneuvers. The knight looks nice, but it doesn't really do much. So in this position you can actually continue your attack with h4, and this is, I think, the best way to punish castling kingside, and you have to be quick. The thing which you can probably conclude immediately visually is that black is far away from creating any sort of attacking chances, and if you can imagine bishop f6, bishop e6, c5, b5 or something like that, then sure, black has some options in the attack, but for now not a single piece apart from the e5 knight is threatening anything in white's position, and white sort of has a free hand in the attack. And if you manage to get your pawn to h6, provoke g6, or if you manage to open up the g-file with knight takes f3, then yeah, it could get scary quickly for black. So this was the sideline with castles, which I wouldn't recommend. After bishop to e3, I would suggest for black the move knight to c6. And knight to c6 prepares to castle queenside. Queen to d2, the same moves for white, and black plays bishop to e6 here, preparing the move queen to d7, castles queenside. And that's very simple for black. It's easy to learn, and you can remember your setup in the main line. Your queen is going to d7 and your king is castling along. So this is fairly simple to play with the black pieces, as opposed to the classical which we saw yesterday, which is horrible. Okay, now once again the question of bishop takes a2 comes to mind. Still white can castle, and still queen to d7 is the main move. Let's look at what happens if bishop takes a2 in this position. If bishop takes a2, once again b3, a5, king to b2, a4. Now the difference is that rook to a1 is slightly more powerful, which means that you can exchange the a8 rook, which is great, because that reduces the chances of your king being checkmated. Rook a1, ab3, cb3, the bishop is still loose, black can take on b3, and now you exchange the rooks, queen takes a8, king takes b3. There are some checks, there are queen a1 infiltrations, but there isn't really much going on, and I think that this position is much better for white, and that there is no compensation for the piece. Queen a1 is the best move, and in this position there have been 4 games, 2 ended in a draw, and 2 were won by white, so black can't really do much, but apparently black can defend. Queen c1, trying to force an exchange of queens, knight a5 check, it's fine. King c2, queen a4 check, king b1, knight c4 is the main move, trading of the pieces, and here I really don't think that black has anything for the piece. The rook is far away from being developed. The best idea might be king d7, rook a8, but still white would have to go badly wrong to lose the game. Okay, so after castles, bishop takes a2 really shouldn't be played, even though some strong players managed to draw the game. I really wouldn't recommend it because of the variation we just saw. Instead of that, queen to d7 and simply preparing to castle. King b1 now, defending the pawn and also removing the king from harm's way, from this diagonal, which might be tricky. Bishop to f6. And now once again, h4 is the main move, but I don't really like the move because the black king hasn't castled kingside yet. So h4 is the main idea here, expanding on the king side, but let's try to find something better. I like the move bishop to g5, simply trying to trade off the bishop because this f6 bishop seems fairly strong. And I also like the idea of h3, g4 and trying to fianchetto my bishop. So h4 is the main move, but after castles, knight d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, this move doesn't really seem that useful. Okay, if you can manage to get in f3, g4 and g5, then at least you are forcing a trade of these bishops, looking at a7, looking at g7, but I'm not sure that can ever happen. Let's look at the main line and then try to find some more ideas. Bishop to e5 is the main move, bishop to e2, queen a4, b3 now chasing the queen away, queen a5, bishop takes e5, d takes e5, queen to g5. You are sacrificing the f3 pawn, but that's what's supposed to happen. You're going to take on g7, queen c3, queen g7, a5, and as I said, I don't really like this position for white, even though the engine says white is better. I think that black has great chances. As opposed to every other variation we were looking at, I think black is actually the one in the driver's seat here and the one attacking. So this main line, even though it seems much better for white, I just don't like it. So after the move bishop to f6, I want to look at the move bishop to g5, which forces a trade, which I think is okay. Black isn't going to take. I think black is just going to castle and try to use the open file, and after takes, this is going to be fine, even though the structure is ruined. Yeah, or queen to e7 can also be played, and bishop takes g5 can also be played, but now after takes, I guess knight takes, and if you can win this bishop, then fine. So bishop to g5 seems like an okay move, at least preventing black from gaining equality in development and castling normally. At least it does something to stop that. And another move, and my favorite move in this position, a move which I've played a lot, is h3. After h3, black should castle, and now after the move g4, I really like my bishop here. Let's say rook to e8, I face this, bishop to g2, and these two bishops seem great. And I think that my bishops are better than black's bishops, especially the dark squared bishop. And I think that there are threats like knight d4 now. If knight takes, bishop takes, then I have threats on g7. I can even recapture with the queen and exchange several pieces. And I think that white stands better here. So I definitely like the move h3 more than I like the move h4. I think this makes a lot of sense. If you ask the engine what it thinks, it says it's equal, but black really has to prove that it's equal. I don't think that black is as good as in the h4 variation. At the end, I want to look at one game where Vishy Anand played Shahryar Mamedyarov, so two super grandmasters battling in the Nimzowitsch Attack of the Petrov. And in the game, Anand played some strange plans and still managed to win, but was worse at a point. So what happened was the main line, knight takes c3, d takes c3, bishop to e7, bishop to e3, knight to c6 was played, so with the plan of castling queenside, queen to d2, bishop to e6, castles, and here Mamedyarov played a strange move. He played a6, a move which shouldn't really be played. As I said, queen to d7 is the main move. You want to castle as soon as possible. a6 doesn't really do that much. It prevents bishop to b5, but bishop to b5 really isn't a threat anyway. a6, and now Vishy Anand returned the favor. He played the move b3, which, I mean, it's a target now. Your king is stuck on c1. And with the pawn on b3, a5, a4 is a strong maneuver. With the pawn on b2, a4, a5, a4 doesn't really exist as an attacking idea. Much better was king to b1. serving the same purpose, defending the pawn and solidifying the position. After b3, Mamedyanov played h6, another strange move. Bishop to e2 was played now. Another inaccuracy, queen to d7 finally, king b1, and I think many people would rather have the pawn on b2 now. Bishop to f6, and now even the c3 pawn is weak. So yeah, I really don't like white's position. The engine says that white is slightly better, but I think black is fine, even though black wasted 2 moves on a6 and h6. Knight d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, at least relieving the pressure of c3. Castles, and now c4. This maneuver I liked. And the engine will tell you that it's equal, the material is completely equal, black has a better pawn structure, and not much going on, despite all the inaccuracies. Rook f8, bishop f3, improving the pieces, rook a to b8. This was the wrong plan, the engine wants him to play rook to d8, but still I think b5 is very sensible because you have all of these anchors in white's position, and let's say d5 or b5 could be really annoying. c5 was played here by Vishy Anand to stop all of these ideas. You cannot take, of course, you lose the bishop. d5, h4, b6, rook h to e1. And the game continued from here, from an equal position. Vishy Anand managed to win in the end, but I just wanted to illustrate how a small mistake, even by a great player, could mean a worse position. So after castles here, a6 was the mistake by Mamedyanov, b3 was the mistake by Anand. And of course, these moves aren't losing, they're playable, you can play such ideas. But I think it's very important to play the Nimzowitsch attack precisely, because if you don't, let's say Mamedyanov played the move a6 here and Vishy Anand played the best move, then he could have gotten an advantage very early on. Okay, to finish the video, I would like to recommend that you take at least 10 or 20 games after knight c3 and knight takes c3, d takes c3. So in the main line of the Nimzowitsch attack, and study the plans. And you should try to find small inaccuracies like this one. And of course, since Vishy Anand won the game, many people wouldn't notice b3 as a mistake. But you should look at the games regardless of the result and try to find mistakes for both sides and try to find the way to punish them, even though the players didn't do it in the game. So b3 is, I think, a very weakening move, and if I were black, I would try to castle kingside and play a5, a4 as soon as possible, because I don't see a comfortable way to defend against that. So try to find games like this one, try to study them, try to find weakening moves for both sides, and then try to use those moves when you face them in the real game. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks very much for the comments and for the support. Let me know what you think about the variation. This is my favorite way to fight the Petrov Defense. And stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye bye.